As the soft morning light peeked through the curtains of a grand mansion, Maria, a young girl barely out of her teens, stepped quietly through the gates. Her heart raced, not because she was nervous about the job she had held for a few months, but because each day here reminded her of the massive divide between her world and the one that unfolded behind those tall, lavish walls. Maria's life had been anything but easy. Born into a family that struggled to make ends meet, she learned early on that nothing came without hard work. After her mother fell ill, Maria had to leave school to find work, and the only job she could get was as a maid at the Billionaire's mansion in the heart of the city. This mansion, with its glittering chandeliers, marble floors, and luxurious furnishings, was a world she couldn't have imagined growing up in her small, worn-out neighborhood. Every day, she polished floors that seemed too clean to need any more scrubbing, and dusted shelves filled with priceless trinkets. But to her, it was a necessary sacrifice for her family. The mansion belonged to Mr. Whitmore, one of the wealthiest and most influential businessmen in the city. His family was well known. His fortune, lifestyle, and connections often made headlines. But Maria never saw much of Mr. Whitmore or his family. The household staff, although large, kept their distance, and Maria often found herself isolated. She preferred it that way. She didn't need anyone knowing the depth of her struggles or the weight she carried on her shoulders. One day, as Maria was busy cleaning the main hall, she heard footsteps approaching. She quickly stood up, eyes down, hoping to avoid attention. But the footsteps stopped. "Hey!" a voice called out. Maria froze. It was familiar, though she rarely heard it directed at her. It was Mr. Whitmore's son, Alexander. Tall with dark hair and striking features, Alexander was known around the mansion for being distant and aloof. He rarely spoke to the staff, and even when he did, it was brief and always with an air of indifference. Maria slowly turned to face him, unsure of what to expect. Her hands were trembling, hidden behind her back, clutching the cleaning rag as if it were a lifeline. Alexander looked at her, his gaze intense but unreadable. "You're Maria, right?" he asked, his tone surprisingly gentle. Maria nodded, confused and wary. Why would someone like him, the son of a billionaire, care to remember the name of a maid? There was a long pause, one that felt like it stretched on for an eternity. The silence hung heavy in the air, almost suffocating, as Maria's heart pounded in her chest. Was she in trouble? Had she done something wrong? But before she could respond, Alexander stepped closer. His expression softened, as if something about this moment had shifted. "You don't need to be afraid," he said quietly. "I just wanted to talk to you." Her mind raced with questions. Why was he being so kind? What could he possibly want with her? She had heard stories about the rich and their strange ways of entertaining themselves, and the last thing Maria wanted was to be caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. But there was something different about the way he spoke, something sincere that she couldn't quite place. Still, she remained on guard, unsure if she could trust him. "What do you need?" she finally asked, her voice small, trying to maintain a respectful distance. Alexander looked at her for a moment, longer before sighing. "I see you working here every day. I know it's not easy." Maria's heart skipped a beat. He had noticed her. Out of all the staff, in a mansion filled with people who barely gave her a second glance, Alexander had noticed her. But why would you care? She blurted out before she could stop herself. Immediately, she regretted her words, her face flushing with embarrassment. She had crossed a line. She was sure of it. But instead of getting angry, Alexander smiled. Just a small, almost sad smile. "I care because, well, I've been thinking. You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who meant a lot to me." Maria blinked, surprised by the unexpected turn in the conversation. Who could she possibly remind him of? And why was he opening up to her, of all people? Just as Maria was about to ask, a voice called out from down the hall, cutting the moment short. It was one of the head staff members, summoning her back to her duties. She hesitated, unsure of what to do. Alexander, noticing her conflict, gave her a nod. "Go on, we'll talk later." Maria nodded back, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. As she walked away, she couldn't help but wonder what had just happened. Why had Alexander, the billionaire's son, who had always seemed so untouchable, suddenly taken an interest in her? And more importantly, what did it mean for her? As she returned to her duties, her hands worked mechanically, but her mind was far from focused. She knew something had changed, but she couldn't quite figure out what. Little did Maria know, this was just the beginning. Something bigger, something life-altering was unfolding, and she was about to find herself caught in the middle of it. And as much as she wanted to ignore it, there was no turning back now. What did Alexander really want from her? And how would her life at the mansion, and beyond, be forever changed by this unexpected encounter? The answers were coming, but for now, all Maria could do was brace herself for the storm that was surely on its way. Maria couldn't shake the strange feeling from her encounter with Alexander. As the days passed, she kept replaying their conversation. In her mind, why had he singled her out? She had been careful to stay invisible, to do her work quietly and not draw attention. But now, things felt different. Every time she saw him in the distance, her heart raced, and she quickly looked away, unsure of how to act. Meanwhile, life in the mansion carried on as usual. Maria woke up before dawn, cleaning the endless rooms, dusting the delicate, expensive decorations that filled every corner. She worked in silence, keeping her thoughts to herself. But the heaviness of the encounter with Alexander stayed with her. The other staff noticed her quiet demeanor, but didn't pry. Maria wasn't one to share much, and everyone had their own lives, their own struggles to deal with. Despite the luxury surrounding her, Maria felt like an outsider, like she didn't belong in this glittering world of wealth and privilege. It wasn't just the lavish lifestyle that set her apart from the Whitmore family. It was the unspoken divide between those who had everything and those who had nothing. Maria had grown up in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper and leaky ceilings. The Whitmores lived in a world where a single painting on their walls could feed Maria's family for years. The more Maria thought about Alexander's words, the more confused she became. Did she really remind him of someone? Or was it just a passing thought, something he said without much meaning? She had no idea who he had lost, or what kind of relationship they shared. But it was clear from the way he spoke that it had left a mark on him. Days later, Maria found herself in the garden, behind the mansion, trimming the hedges as the sun began to set. The garden was vast, filled with perfectly manicured flowers and tall, ancient trees that made it feel like a world of its own. The peacefulness of the space had always been a comfort to her, one of the few places she felt she could breathe, without the weight of expectations on her shoulders. But today, the quiet didn't offer her the same comfort. As she worked, she heard footsteps behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew it was him even before he spoke. "Maria," Alexander said softly, his voice carrying across the garden. She straightened up, turning to face him. His presence felt different now, more personal, more intense. He wasn't just the billionaire's son anymore. He was someone with questions, with intentions she couldn't fully understand. "I've been meaning to talk to you again," he said, his eyes searching hers. Maria kept her gaze steady, though her heart was racing. "About what?" He took a deep breath, as if deciding how much to reveal. I know you've had a hard life. I can see it in your eyes. You've had to work for everything, haven't you? She didn't answer right away. What could she say? Her life had been nothing but hard work. But that wasn't something she wanted to discuss with someone like him. I don't mean to intrude, he continued, sensing her hesitation. It's just, you remind me of someone. My mother. Maria blinked in surprise. This wasn't what she expected. She had heard about Alexander's mother in passing from the other staff, how she had been kind but sickly, and how her death years ago had left a deep scar on the Whitmore family. She was the only person who ever really understood me, Alexander said quietly. She came from nothing too, just like you. She worked hard for everything she had. I see that same determination in you. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. She had never expected someone like Alexander to open up to her like this, to draw such a connection between their lives. But before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. It was Mr. Whitmore, his towering figure casting a long shadow over the garden. What's going on here? Mr. Whitmore asked, his voice cold and authoritative. Maria instantly lowered her eyes, stepping back, her body tensed, fearing she had somehow crossed a line by talking to Alexander. But Alexander didn't move. He held his ground, his expression hardening as he faced his father. Nothing, Alexander replied, his tone sharp. We were just talking. Mr. Whitmore's gaze flickered toward Maria, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny. He had never paid her much attention before, but now his eyes seemed to narrow in suspicion. Alexander, he said sternly, we don't fraternize with the staff. Maria felt a sharp pang of embarrassment. She wasn't sure what to do, but she knew this conversation was dangerous for her. She could lose her job, her only source of income for her family. But before she could slip away, Alexander spoke up again, his voice steady. Why not? Maria works harder than anyone in this house. She deserves respect. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. Was he really standing up for her? Was this going to cause trouble? Mr. Whitmore's eyes darkened. This is not up for discussion, Alexander. The staff know their place, and you should remember yours. Without another word, Mr. Whitmore turned and walked away, leaving a heavy silence behind him. Maria stood frozen, unsure of what just happened. Alexander, however, remained calm, his gaze still on her. I'm sorry, he said softly, once his father was out of earshot. I didn't mean to put you in that position. Maria finally found her voice. It's okay. I should get back to work. But before she could leave, Alexander stepped forward, his expression serious. This isn't over, Maria. I meant what I said. You deserve better. Maria nodded, though her mind was swirling with questions. What did he mean? What was he planning? As she walked back to the mansion, Maria knew that her life was about to change, but she wasn't sure if it would be for better or worse. One thing was certain. Alexander's defiance of his father had set something in motion, and there was no telling how it would end. The days that followed felt like a blur for Maria. She tried to focus on her duties, but Alexander's words kept echoing in her mind. You deserve better. It was such a simple statement, yet it stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to think about in a long time. Hope. Alexander's behavior toward her became more noticeable after that encounter in the garden. He made no attempt to hide his kindness or the conversations they shared. Despite his father's obvious disapproval, he would ask her about her family, her dreams, and her life before she started working at the mansion. Maria found herself opening up to him in ways she never expected. She told him about her mother's illness, her younger siblings, and how she had dropped out of school to support them. She spoke of the struggles, the sacrifices, and the weight of responsibility she carried every day. In return, Alexander shared his own frustrations with his privileged life. He had been expected to follow in his father's footsteps, but he felt trapped, suffocated by the expectations that came with being a Whitmore. Despite their vastly different worlds, they found a connection in their shared longing for something more, something meaningful beyond the lives they had been born into. But not everyone was blind to their growing bond. The other staff started whispering when they saw Alexander lingering near Maria, offering her help with small tasks or catching her in quiet conversations. And then there was Mr. Whitmore, whose cold gaze seemed to follow them wherever they went. One evening, as Maria was finishing her work in the kitchen, the butler approached her, a grim expression on his face. "Mr. Whitmore wants to see you in his office." Maria felt her stomach drop. She had been expecting this moment, dreading it, but now it was here. Her hand shook as she made her way through the long, dimly lit hallways toward Mr. Whitmore's office. When she arrived, she found him sitting behind his large mahogany desk, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You've become quite familiar with my son," Mr. Whitmore said, his voice cold and measured. Maria stood frozen, unsure how to respond. She knew there was no point in denying it. "I'll get straight to the point," he continued, not waiting for her to speak. "Whatever you think you're doing with Alexander, it ends now." His words stung, but Maria remained silent, her eyes lowered. "You've been given a good opportunity here," he said. "You should be grateful, but don't mistake kindness for something more. People like you and my son, you don't belong in the same world." Maria's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with her family depending on her. "I understand, sir," she whispered. Mr. Whitmore studied her for a moment before nodding. "Good. I expect you to keep your distance from Alexander from now on. If you don't, you'll be out of here faster than you can pack your bags." Maria nodded, her throat tight with fear and frustration. She had always known her place, but hearing it laid out so bluntly hurt more than she expected. As she left the office, she felt a crushing weight on her shoulders. She knew she had no choice but to comply. Her family's survival depended on her keeping this job, but that didn't stop the ache in her chest, the feeling of something precious slipping away. The next day, Maria did as she was told. She avoided Alexander, focusing on her work and staying as invisible as possible. She could feel his eyes on her sometimes, but she didn't dare look back. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them grew. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One afternoon, as Maria was cleaning the large chandelier in the grand foyer, she heard voices from the sitting room. She recognized Mr. Whitmore's deep tone, followed by another familiar voice, Alexander's. "You can't control my life, Dad," Alexander said, his voice firm. "I'm not trying to control your life. I'm trying to protect you," Mr. Whitmore replied sharply. "That girl, Maria, she's just after what she can get. You're blinded by your emotions." Maria's heart raced. She shouldn't be listening, but she couldn't move. "I don't care what you think," Alexander shot back. "Maria isn't like that. She's hardworking, honest. She's more genuine than anyone in this house." There was a long pause, and Maria could hear the tension in the air. "If you continue with this nonsense, I will disinherit you," Mr. Whitmore finally said, his voice cold and final. "You'll lose everything." Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Maria held her breath, waiting for Alexander's response. "Then so be it," Alexander said, quietly but with conviction. "I'd rather lose everything than live like this." Maria's breath caught in her throat. Was he serious? Was he really willing to give up his fortune, his entire life, for someone like her? She didn't have time to dwell on it, because moments later, Alexander appeared at the bottom of the staircase, his eyes locked onto hers. And for the first time in weeks, Maria couldn't look away. "We need to talk," he said, his voice filled with determination. Maria followed him outside, her heart pounding. When they reached the garden, Alexander turned to her, his face a mix of emotions. "I don't care about the money, the house, any of it," he said. "All I care about is you. I've been thinking about it for weeks, and I've made my decision. I'm leaving this place, and I want you to come with me." Maria was speechless. She had never imagined this. Never thought someone like Alexander would choose her, would be willing to leave everything behind for her. But as much as her heart wanted to say yes, reality hit her like a cold wave. "I can't," she whispered. "My family. They need me. I can't just walk away." Alexander's face softened with understanding. He took her hand gently. "Then let me help you. We can figure it out together." In that moment, Maria realized that this was more than just a decision about her future. It was about finding her worth, believing that she deserved more than what life had given her. And maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who saw that too. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "We'll figure it out." And as they stood there in the fading light, Maria knew that her life was about to change forever. But this time, she wasn't afraid.